When the shooting started at Willow Creek, Sergeant Ezra Holbrook had a choice: die with his men or live as a coward. He chose cowardice. Now, 3 years later, he's riding back to face the mothers and fathers of the boys he left to bleed out in the mud. And they've been waiting. The dust had settled on Cedar Ridge 3 years before Ezra Holbrook returned, but the ghosts had not. They lingered in the spaces between words unspoken. In the careful way mothers pulled their children closer when his name was whispered, in the hollow silence that followed whenever someone dared mention the Battle of Willow Creek. The morning he rode back into town, the sun hung low and bloody over the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him like the fingers of the dead. Ezra's horse picked its way carefully down the main street, hooves striking the hard-packed earth with a rhythm that matched the beating of his damaged heart. Every window seemed to hold watching eyes, every doorway a judgment. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The baker's wife dropped her broom. Even the dogs seemed to sense something shameful in the air and slunk away, tails low. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times during the long nights on the trail, had imagined himself proud and defiant, ready to face whatever waited for him. But now, with the weight of their stares pressing down like a physical thing, he felt only the familiar taste of cowardice, bitter as alkali water on his tongue. His uniform was gone, traded months ago for civilian clothes and a few dollars, but he could still feel its phantom weight on his shoulders, still hear the screams of dying men echoing in the chambers of his memory. The hotel stood before him like a gallows, its painted sign weathered and peeling. Ezra dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had learned to anticipate pain. His left leg bore the scar of a Confederate bullet, taken not in the heat of battle but during his shameful flight, a wound that marked him as surely as any brand. The injury had saved his life in one sense. It gave him an excuse to tell himself, a reason beyond pure terror for why he had abandoned his post. But lies, he had learned, were harder to live with than bullets. Inside, the hotel clerk looked up from his ledger, recognition dawning in his eyes like a slow sunrise. The man's face went through a series of small transformations: surprise, understanding, then something harder to name. Not quite hatred, but close enough to taste. "Room," Ezra said, the word falling flat in the sudden quiet. "We're full up," the clerk replied, though the key rack behind him told a different story. Ezra placed a silver dollar on the scarred wooden counter. Then another. The clerk's eyes never left his face, studying him like a specimen, like something that had crawled out from under a rock to be examined in the harsh light of day. Finally, with movements that spoke of reluctance and distaste, the man selected a key. "Room 12, upstairs." The stairs creaked under Ezra's weight, each step a small announcement of his presence to whoever might be listening. The room was sparse: a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the cemetery where too many young men had found their final rest. He stood at that window for a long time, watching the wind move through the grass that grew over graves, some marked with proper stones, others with simple wooden crosses that time and weather had already begun to claim. Below, the town went about its business with the deliberate normalcy of people trying not to look at something unpleasant. But Ezra could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Word would spread. Already was spreading, he imagined, carried from door to door by the women who had perfected the art of meaningful glances and weighted silences. The first knock came at sundown. Ezra had been expecting it, had been sitting in the room's single chair facing the door, waiting like a condemned man for his appointment with the rope. But when he opened the door and saw Margaret Brennan standing in the hallway, her small fist raised to knock again, the careful composure he had built crumbled like poorly mortared stone. She was smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as if grief had worn her down like water on limestone. Her dress was black, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and cuffs, but carefully mended. A widow's weeds, he realized, and the knowledge hit him like a physical blow. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, though her name came out strangled, barely more than a whisper. "You remember me then?" Her voice carried no surprise, only a weariness that seemed bone deep. "Good. I was afraid you might have forgotten all of us in your travels." She stepped into the room without invitation, moving with the careful economy of someone who had learned to husband her strength. Ezra closed the door behind her, his hand trembling on the handle. When he turned back, she was standing by the window, looking out at the cemetery. "He's out there," she said, nodding toward the graves. "Patrick. They brought him back in pieces, but they brought him back. More than some got." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and stinging. Ezra wanted to speak, to offer some explanation or apology, but everything he might have said seemed inadequate, small and pathetic against the magnitude of her loss. 23 years old, Margaret continued, her voice never changing in pitch or timbre. Never married, never had children, never got to see his mother's face again before she died. She went to her grave believing her son was a hero. "He was," Ezra managed, the words scraping his throat raw. "Patrick was brave. Braver than you." Margaret turned from the window, and for the first time, Ezra saw the full weight of her anger. It was a terrible thing, cold and controlled, refined by years of careful tending into something sharp enough to cut. "Yes, Ezra Holbrook, braver than you." She moved closer, and he found himself backing away, though she posed no physical threat. But there were other kinds of danger, other ways to be wounded, and Margaret Brennan carried them all in the space behind her eyes. "Do you know what the last thing Patrick said was, before he died?" She was close enough now that he could see the fine lines that grief had etched around her eyes, the gray that had crept into her dark hair, like frost on autumn grass. "He called for you, even with his guts spilled out in the mud, even dying alone and afraid. He called for his sergeant, called for you to come back and help him." The room spun around Ezra like a child's top, and he reached out blindly for the wall to steady himself. But there was no steadying against words like these, no bulwark strong enough to hold back the flood of shame that threatened to drown him where he stood. "I didn't know," he whispered, though the excuse felt hollow even to his own ears. "Of course you didn't know. You were running." Margaret's voice never rose above a conversational tone, but each word landed with the precision of a surgeon's knife. "Running while good men died. Running while Patrick bled out calling your name." She was at the door now, her hand on the knob, but she paused and looked back at him one last time. The anger had drained from her face, leaving only exhaustion and something that might have been pity. "I came here to hurt you," she said, "to make you feel some small portion of what I've felt these past 3 years. But looking at you now, I can see that someone already has." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell. Ezra stood alone in the gathering darkness, listening to her footsteps fade down the hallway, carrying with them any hope he might have harbored that time had dulled the edges of what he had done. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. In his dreams, he was back at Willow Creek, the morning mist clinging to the grass like the breath of dying men. The Confederate charge came again, gray uniforms emerging from the dawn like specters, bayonets glinting with cold fire. And again, as he had 3 years before, Ezra felt the familiar ice in his veins, the terrible loosening of his bowels, the urgent whisper in his mind that screamed, "Run, run, run." But in the dream, he could see Patrick Brennan's face among his men, young and trusting, looking to his sergeant for guidance. Could see the exact moment when understanding dawned, when Patrick realized that his leader was not going to lead, was going to leave them to face the storm alone. Ezra woke to find his pillow soaked with tears and his body shaking like a leaf in winter wind. Dawn was breaking gray and cheerless through the window, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell was calling the faithful to morning prayer. He wondered if there was prayer enough in all the world to wash clean what he had done. The second knock came while he was shaving, his hand unsteady on the razor's handle. This time it was a man, tall, weathered, with hands that spoke of honest labor and eyes that held no mercy. Ezra recognized him immediately. Jonas Whitmore, whose son David had been barely 18 when he fell at Willow Creek. Holbrook. The name was spoken like a curse, flat and final. Jonas pushed into the room without ceremony, his bulk filling the doorway like a storm cloud. "Thought you were dead." "Disappointed?" Ezra set down the razor, his face only half shaved, foam still clinging to his jaw like snow on a mountainside. "Would have been cleaner." Jonas moved to the center of the room, his presence making the small space feel even smaller. Easier for everyone. They stood facing each other in the morning light, two men separated by more than just the few feet of worn wooden floor between them. Here was the father of a boy who had died believing in duty and honor, facing the man who had taught him that such things were lies. Pretty words to dress up the ugly business of dying for nothing. David talked about you, Jonas said, his voice carefully controlled. In his letters home. Sergeant Holbrook this, Sergeant Holbrook that. Thought you hung the moon and stars? The words were meant to wound, and they found their mark with the accuracy of a marksman's bullet. Ezra felt something inside him crack, like ice on a pond too long frozen. He was a good soldier, Ezra said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. He was a boy. Jonas's control slipped for just a moment, revealing the raw grief beneath. 18 years old, never been with a woman, never been drunk, never done nothing but help his mother tend the garden and dream about being a man. And you left him to die like a dog in the mud. The accusation hung between them, simple and devastating. There was no complexity here, no room for explanations or justifications, just the bare truth of what had happened, stripped of all the pretty lies Ezra had told himself during the long nights on the trail. I was afraid, he said, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside, somewhere he had tried to keep locked and buried. I was afraid, and I ran. Jonas nodded, as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. I know, we all know. Question is, what are you going to do about it now? The question caught Ezra off guard. He had expected anger, hatred, perhaps even violence. But this calm demand for action, for some kind of response to the enormity of what he had done, left him floundering. I don't know, he said, and the honesty of it surprised them both. Well, you better figure it out quick. Jonas moved toward the door, his business apparently concluded. Because word's spreading. By tonight, everyone in town's going to know you're here, and some of them aren't going to be as reasonable as me. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the door frame. David kept a journal, wrote in it every day, right up until the end. His mother found it in his things, sent it home with his body. You want to know what the last entry said? Ezra didn't want to know, but he found himself nodding anyway, drawn toward the knowledge like a moth to flame. It said, tomorrow we fight. Whatever happens, I know Sergeant Holbrook will see us through. He's the bravest man I ever knew. Jonas's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the door frame. That's what my boy died believing, that you were brave. The door closed, leaving Ezra alone with the terrible weight of a dead boy's faith. He finished shaving with mechanical precision, his hands now steady as stone, then dressed carefully in his best clothes. If he was going to face what was coming, he would do it properly dressed. The town square at noon was fuller than it had any right to be on a weekday. Word had indeed spread, carried from house to house by the mysterious network that small towns used to transmit news of scandal or significance. They stood in small groups, these people whose sons and husbands and brothers had died under his command, their faces composed but their eyes holding depths of feeling that made Ezra's chest tight. He had not planned this confrontation, had intended to stay in his room until he could think of some way to leave town without further shame. But Margaret Brennan's words had worked on him like acid on metal, eating away at his resolve until only the raw core remained. He could not run again. Whatever else he was, whatever else he had done, he could not be the man who ran twice from the same burden. So he walked out into the square and stood in its center, feeling the weight of their stares like physical pressure against his skin. The afternoon sun was hot and merciless, beating down on his uncovered head, but he made no move to seek shade or shelter. This was his penance, to stand exposed under the harsh light and let them see what their sacrifices had purchased. I suppose you're wondering why I came back, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. No one answered, but he had not expected them to. This was not a conversation, it was a confession, pure and simple. I've been running for 3 years, he continued. Running from what I did, from what I didn't do. Running from the sound of Patrick Brennan calling my name as he died. Running from the memory of David Whitmore's face when he realized I wasn't coming back. A woman in the crowd made a sound, half sob, half moan. Ezra didn't look to see who it was. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, on the place where the sky met the earth in a line straight as justice. I told myself stories, he said. Pretty lies about being wounded, about being overwhelmed, about doing what I had to do to survive. But they were all lies. The truth is simpler and uglier. When the shooting started, when men began to die, I was afraid. Afraid of pain, afraid of death, afraid of everything except the one thing I should have feared most, living with the knowledge of what I was about to do. The crowd was utterly silent now, hanging on his every word. Even the children had stopped their playing, sensing the gravity of the moment even if they couldn't understand its meaning. "I can't give you back your sons," Ezra said, his voice beginning to crack under the strain. "I can't undo what I did or make it right. I can't even promise that I would act differently if faced with the same choice again, because I don't know. I don't know if I'm any braver now than I was then." He lowered his eyes from the horizon, meeting the gaze of the people he had wronged. Margaret Brennan stood near the front, her face wet with tears. Jonas Whitmore was beside her, his massive frame rigid with controlled emotion. Behind them, other faces, some familiar, some not, all marked by loss. "But I can tell you this," Ezra continued. "Your boys died believing in something. In duty, in honor, in the idea that good men stand by each other when the world goes dark. I failed them in that moment, but they didn't fail. They stood. They fought. They died as men should die, defending what they believed in." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. The money he had saved during his years of exile, earned by honest labor but forever tainted by the circumstances of his earning it. "This is all I have," he said, holding the pouch out toward them. "It's not much, not nearly enough, but it's what I can offer. For the families, for the wives and mothers and children left behind." No one moved to take the money. It sat in his outstretched palm like a reproach, a tangible symbol of the inadequacy of any restitution he might offer. "We don't want your money," said a voice from the crowd. Mary Chen, whose husband had died trying to rally the men after Ezra's desertion. "Money won't bring them back." "No," Ezra agreed, "it won't." "Then what will?" The question came from a young woman he didn't recognize, barely out of her teens, holding a baby in her arms. "What can you possibly do to make this right?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, acrid and impossible to ignore. Ezra looked at the young woman, at the child in her arms who would grow up without ever knowing his father, and felt the last of his carefully constructed defenses crumble. "Nothing," he said, the word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. "There's nothing I can do to make this right. No words I can speak, no actions I can take, no penance I can perform that will balance the scales of what I owe." He let his hand fall to his side, the pouch of coins clutched in his fist. The weight of their stares was becoming unbearable, but he forced himself to remain standing, to face the full measure of their judgment. "Then why did you come back?" This from an older man, gray-bearded and stern. "Why put us through this if you can't fix what you broke?" The question struck at the heart of everything, the central mystery that had driven Ezra back to this place of judgment. Why had he come? What force had compelled him to abandon the relative peace of exile for this crucible of shame and recrimination? "Because running didn't work," he said finally. "Because living with lies is harder than dying with the truth. Because your sons deserve better than to be abandoned twice, once on the battlefield and again in memory." He took a deep breath, tasting dust and sorrow on the desert air. "I came back because I couldn't stay away, because every sunset reminded me of the last light in Patrick Brennan's eyes, and every dawn brought back the sound of David Whitmore calling for help that never came. I came back because the dead don't stay buried when you carry them with you." Margaret Brennan stepped forward from the crowd, her small frame somehow commanding in the afternoon light. She walked slowly toward Ezra, her eyes never leaving his face, until she stood close enough to touch. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence, the mother of the dead and the man who had failed to save him. Then, with a movement so quick it caught him off guard, she raised her hand and struck him across the face. The slap cracked like a rifle shot in the still air, and Ezra's head snapped to the side with the force of it. But he made no move to defend himself, no gesture of anger or retaliation. He simply stood there, taking the blow as he had taken everything else, as his due. "That's for running," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. The crowd waited, holding its collective breath to see what would happen next. But Margaret Brennan was not done. She reached out again, this time gently, and placed her hand against the cheek she had just struck. "And this," she said softly, "is for coming back." The gesture broke something in the crowd, some dam of held emotion that had been straining against its banks since Ezra first rode into town. People began to move forward, slowly at first, then with more purpose. They didn't speak, didn't offer forgiveness or condemnation. They simply came closer, creating a circle around him, including him in their grief rather than casting him out from it. Jonas Whitmore was among them, his weathered face streaked with tears. He didn't speak, but he placed one massive hand on Ezra's shoulder, the weight of it both burden and benediction. Others followed suit, touches that conveyed what words could not, a complex mixture of anger and sorrow and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, Ezra found himself surrounded by the families of the men he had failed. They did not absolve him of his guilt. That was not theirs to give. But they acknowledged him as part of their story, part of the complicated tapestry of loss and memory that bound them all together. "What will you do now?" asked Mary Chen, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing in them reflections of his own guilt and grief. These people had lived for 3 years with the consequences of his cowardice, had built their lives around the holes left by absent fathers and sons and husbands. They had found ways to carry on, to honor their dead while continuing to serve the living. "I don't know," he said, the honest uncertainty in his voice somehow more comforting than any false promise might have been. "I suppose I'll have to learn how to live with what I've done, how to carry it without being crushed by it." "We all have to learn that," said Margaret Brennan. "We all have to find ways to live with loss." The crowd began to disperse as the light faded, people drifting away to their evening meals and daily routines. But the circle around Ezra remained, a core of those most deeply affected by his choices. They stood together in the gathering dusk, bound by shared sorrow and the fragile possibility of something beyond mere survival. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ezra felt something he had not experienced in 3 years. Not peace, for that was still beyond his reach, but something quieter and more sustainable. The weight of his guilt had not diminished, would never diminish, but it had changed somehow. Where before it had been a crushing burden that drove him to flee, now it felt like ballast, something heavy but necessary that might help him stand steady in whatever storms lay ahead. The dead were still dead. Patrick Brennan would never see another sunrise. David Whitmore would never write another letter home. And all the others whose names were carved in stone would never laugh or love or dream again. Nothing Ezra could do would change that fundamental truth. But perhaps in time, he might learn to honor their memory not through the grand gesture of heroic sacrifice, but through the quieter courage of daily existence. Perhaps he might find ways to serve the living that would not dishonor the dead. Perhaps the boy who had believed his sergeant was the bravest man he ever knew had not been entirely wrong. Not because Ezra was brave then, but because he might yet become the man that boy had seen in him. The desert wind picked up as full darkness fell, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Ezra breathed it in deeply, tasting possibility on the night air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to fail or succeed, to run or stand. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he was not running. Tonight, he was home. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.